Hey, g'day. Welcome back to People Purpose Place for our Monday lunchtime chat. Today we've got a new face here. We've got an economics student who's been doing some really interesting stuff. Young Hunter, how are you today, sir?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, well, you're always good to compare notes and chat people who are interested in this space. And Darren, how are you travelling this week?
Yeah, good. Yeah, it's only Monday, so nothing's gone majorly wrong yet. So that's a good start.
Yeah, you got to love it while you're in front. That's it.
Yeah.
So this week we've got a deep dive into some of the media that's been talking about, headlines have grabbed our attention over the last few days, and Hunter has done some work in this space in particular. So we thought it'd be worth to talk about essential workers and where to from here. Very loosely, we might be considering, what does it mean if you're an essential worker who has to your work is a hospital or a school or a place that's geographically fixed. How are you able to live near there? And this probably is going to show up some fairly interesting numbers worth a bit of a conversation.
Absolutely, and I think also complexity in the conversation, right? So
yeah,
and I think we can talk to particularly the Courier Mail had an article today which specifically has some information about nurses, which was why that caught my eye, because I know that Hunter's had mentioned doing some work with uni in regards to specifically the nurses' situation, and the complexities and the nuances are there. So you've got, what's happening with nurses in general, and what are they, what's the need for nurses in Australia, and how are we filling that need, and all of those things. And then we're layering over then the complexity of what does that mean to housing? Yeah. And then the last bit is really, then what does that mean socially? Like, does that actually work? You join the complexity of the employment, the complexity of the housing model, and then you go, well, does that actually make any sense? Because obviously People Purpose Place has people at the front for a reason. So I thought it'd be great to also have two perspectives, one being Hunter as a person who's got to consider, going out to, after finishing university, to go and get, employment potentially in a capital city or not in a capital city, but also then his unique perspective in regards to the complexity of the whole issue in regards to nurses. So I think it could be a really good conversation.
Indeed. I think it's probably worth pausing for a moment to have a check-in.
Yes.
And Hunter, if you're not familiar with the concept, we ask a question and we invite all of our attendees to have a response. We asked Darren to keep it under 47 minutes. And for the rest of us, we probably manage it at about a minute. But
whatever.
Just subtle. I'm going for subtle.
Yeah. But no,
the check-in question, if you haven't read it, is the assumption: should nurses, teachers, policemen, and firefighters be able to live in the community they serve? I don't think that's an unreasonable question. Hunter, do you have some immediate thoughts?
I think they need to. I think that there's I believe when you're serving in a community, in a public role like that, I feel like connection to community is important. Yeah. I feel like the work that they do is valuable, and it stretches beyond that. I think a sense of purpose in the workplace goes a long way. So I know that we're going to be talking about labor retention later, and that's a big part of it. A lot of people leave industry when they don't feel appreciated, when they don't feel a connection to the work they do.
Yep.
So I think it's important that they live, and I mean that's for a number of reasons, for their own sake and for the sake of people that need their care. Housing needs to be accessible in the area that they work in. Otherwise, for some of those occupations there, it's just not possible.
Darren, what are your thoughts?
It's always good going second because you don't really have to add much in. But I think the one word that I had come to mind was valuable. We sort of sometimes struggle with, what's a more valuable employee or person to have in your community. And there's no doubt we need that layer. Just because you've got the doctor who might be on $500,000 a year, are they any more valuable than the person like the nurse who's providing the care after that? And I think that's one thing our society maybe doesn't value enough, and obviously that's reflected in their wages. The teachers and the nurses aren't getting what those other people probably are, but they're just as important for our societal makeup. So I agree with Hunter 100%. So, what about yourself?
Yeah, and to my mind, it seems to be a no-brainer that if you are a teacher at a highfalutin inner city school, it probably makes sense that you reside and operate in that community, can engage in that community. And perhaps that's absolutely not possible at the moment. And of course, there will be people that make personal choices to maintain horses on the weekend. I want to go riding on horses, so I want acreage property. So that means that's a personal choice rather than wanting an inner city address.
Yep.
I think absolutely we see poor outcomes where we have vast amounts of workforce fly in, fly out. We've got examples where they don't necessarily engage in a community. If they're bused to and from a work site and they fly out on the end of their shift, you don't actually see and get any of that engagement in some examples. So I think we know and have seen where it doesn't work. And I think definitely we should have more engagement of workers in their community.
Yep. Agreed.
So I guess we've covered the intent, and perhaps, the idea is, are there better ways for housing than the business as usual model, or is there no alternative to the current system?
Yep.
So do we want to maybe jump into some numbers to start with? Because I think as a default setting, we start there with the economics and talk about what do these numbers mean.
Yeah, and it might even be worth, just asking the question in the first instance, what course are you actually studying, Hunter, at the moment, and where are you at in that course?
So I'm third year, so my final year in my Bachelor of Commerce at JCU. So majoring in double major in economics and financial management. Next year I will be coming back again for my honours in economics, which is a extra year specifically to do research into a topic of my choosing.
Yep.
But yeah, I'll be getting my bachelor's degree in December.
Awesome. And I'd imagine you'll rack up a nice HECS debt by the time you finish that. What does that end up, just as a matter of interest?
I think for your bachelor's degree, I'm looking at north of $41,000. Just for the bachelor's, and then with the HECS, it's about equivalent again, so another $12,000-13,000 on top of that. Beyond your honours, you have the option of obviously completing a PhD. If you do achieve a first-class distinction in your honours, you get the uni actually subsidises that completely. But if they don't, that's another $40,000 on top of that. So you could be potentially exiting into the workforce with over $100,000 in debt.
Wow, which is actually an important part of this conversation, right? Because, and that's with this complexity of this issue. So I don't know whether Colby, if you could just call up, I think at the top of the actual report today in the Courier Mail. Basically, the premise behind it was, and this is why it sort of caught my eye in the first instance, was that nurses wanting to live close to Brisbane hospitals face the grim prospect of up to 70% of their combined household income tied up in a mortgage. Or if they didn't want to do that, rents were over $570 a week. And the Deputy Mayor and Planning Minister said these figures were alarming. And that's great while he lives in his nice flash house wherever he's living. And he said the government faces the enormous challenge of the fact that there's still so many more people to come into the state. in the next 20 years. And obviously also on top of that, with the Olympics, that means there's a massive push towards that. So, and the other background bits, which I think we'll jump into later on with some more specific numbers. But according to the analysis, the take-home pay of a registered nurse and a teacher is about $1,200 a week. A week. Yes, that's right. And obviously, when you have a look at lay that against the data of how much it is to live in those places, you start to have some, pretty worrying concerns. But maybe if we start with the with the complexity of the actual nurses' situation, because I had actually heard this a little bit back and forth with Hunter a couple of months ago, just trying to understand the challenges that particularly nurses face. What did you find, or what were some interesting things that you found out by, specifically looking at the nurses' situation, Hunter? Like, what makes that such a big challenge?
I think the biggest challenge is when you look at our need for nurses compared to what we actually have. So there's such a vast difference between demand and supply in this instance. So over the next 25 years, we're going to need 20 to 40,000 more nurses than are enrolled currently.
Wow.
And when you pair that with the aging population, so Colby, I think there's a graph in there specifically talking about Townsville's aging population. You can see over the past 20 years, like the need for nurses is only increasing, and it's not going to slow down anytime soon. And in terms of attempts to fix this, the government has persistently looked at education. But we'd done a report looking at retention in public hospitals, and what we found was there's no point looking at education if the nurses quit. So the biggest issue of why we don't have nurses is because they're leaving the industry or they're not working full time. So that's the driving force.
We've seen that in a few conversations with nursing practitioners who've made all sorts of comments about their place of work, and they're no longer delivering the care or the quality of care they felt they needed to. So that's been reflected in conversation with established long-serving medical staff just getting out of Queensland Health.
So just so I understand that, is there a difference? Like, is there a level of nurse that has to go to university? Like, is there a difference between those two categories, or?
Well, a registered nurse would be considered somebody who has completed nursing's a 3-year degree. So you get your Bachelor of Nursing. Throughout that degree, you have certain compulsory blocks of placement. So I don't have the exact number, but I believe it's about 6 months of that degree is actually in placement. And that's to become a registered nurse, which is one of the other interesting points was that with conversations with people in nursing, you found that the graduates aren't prepped for the workplace. So one of the greatest drains on the sector is professional burnout and fatigue, and that can be attributed to our fresh graduates not understanding their role in the workplace. Which is quite interesting. If you look at when they graduate, it's close to 83% of nurses go to full-time work, yet the industry average for nursing is 50% of them. So between graduation and the average, 32% of nurses drift from full-time to part-time work.
Yeah, right. And what do they put that down to? So they're coming out and then they're going, wow, this is a hell of a lot harder than I thought it might be. Is that what you're thinking? And then that eventually leads to burnout, and then they have a less actual time in the job.
Well, there's quite obviously nursing is a full-on job. It's the hours are not necessarily set. You've got night shift to manage, but through looking over quite a few reports, quite a few surveys, the key issue seems to be financial stress, so an inability to cope with cost of living. That nurses' wages aren't necessarily competitive. They have grown relatively consistently with CPI, with inflation, but as we know, inflation is prices, it's not costs. The other big one is looking to spend time with their family and children. So given their role and given the condition of their role, spending time and raising a family is just not doable. When you couple that with childcare costs, it becomes increasingly difficult. So, for instance, childcare, as in young children daycare, has risen over the past 4 years between 20 and 32%. That's the cost of childcare, which obviously far exceeds inflation and far exceeds wage growth. So, as a young parent, especially if you're a young single parent, it gets to the point where you don't have the capacity financially to send your children to daycare. And in some instances, that means you have to go to part-time work to look after your own children.
Which is there's a bit of an irony there, isn't there, Rowan? As far as we've talked about this space quite a bit, housing prices have really been coupled with the fact that couples can both be employed. So we've got this situation where prices have skyrocketed when two people in the household were essentially had the ability to service the loan. And the challenge with that is then both people are then locked into this idea of having to work with this almost intuitive nature of, if you're a nurse, you probably come from a caring space. And I would imagine there'd have to be a super high percentage of females versus males in nursing, I would suggest.
Yeah, I think it's upwards of 85% of nurses, registered nurses, are female, and that number is actually increasing. So the age distribution is shifting quite a bit. The nurses are getting older, but they're not getting any more diluted by male nurses. So there is obviously something to be said about that, and that translates to quite a few things. So you're looking at the first 5 years of nurses dropping out. You've got to think about maternity leave comes into factor. You're in that age of 22 to 28 years old is the most common graduation. Graduating age for a nurse, so that comes into play as well.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. So all those, and that's why this issue is so much more complex than just having a look at the baseline values. And it makes so much sense. We've talked about the whole idea that if the cost of living becomes so high that you can't even afford, you want to look after your children yourself, but you can't afford to do that. This dual-edged sword of, I need to work enough to put my children into care. And if I stay at home, then I can't service the loan. So I caught in this perpetual loop of how do I balance the working versus not? What incentives have they put out there to try and get more nurses into nursing, Hunter?
Well, I suppose the biggest example would be the New South Wales government has recently passed this, and it's been used in many other countries as well, and that is completely subsidising nursing degrees. So if you, under the condition that you are retained into the state, so New South Wales would fully subsidise, so all HECS covered, offer you a position in nursing, contingent on the fact that you remain in New South Wales beyond your graduation and that you work in their hospitals.
So that then captures you to public hospital jobs rather than private hospital jobs, and you have to remain in New South Wales. Yeah,
but that's the biggest need at the moment is public hospital. With the growth of contracted and private work and the NDIS, there's an increasing number of registered nurses who just think that there's no point working public. If the pay is better, the hours are more flexible, there's better room for growth, you have more control over your own career. More and more nurses are choosing to go private or contracted. So I think that's mainly where the policy is how do they keep nurses in the public sector?
Yeah. And that's interesting because so what you're saying is that probably isn't even working, because we know that even if there's more nurses coming through the system, if they fall out quicker, then ultimately it's like a never-ending churn and burn with adding more nurses who are potentially working less hours, which means the void is really not going anywhere.
Yeah, well, there's actually a source in that Google Doc too, Colby. I believe it's number 5 there. It shows that this is a study done in the UK, which had a similar scenario where they subsidized completely nursing. In the UK, an eye is the highest grade you can get.
Mhm.
So the worse the nurses performed in university, they were much more likely to work part-time. So those who realistically, by our standards, graduated with a GPA between 6 and 7, none of them worked part-time in the first 5 years. Whereas those who just scraped past their degrees, nearly 40% of them were working part-time within the first 5 years. So incentivizing people to go and join nursing because it's free isn't necessarily keeping us with nurses.
Ah, right. I get it. That makes so much sense. So you're saying that some of those people might have just done it because it was subsidized, and then subsequently, if they don't have a purpose, a really passionate purpose to be, engaged in that career, then their drop-off rates are actually quite high. That's interesting, isn't it?
And to some extent, increasing graduates in nursing isn't necessarily increasing registered nurses. So over a 24-month period, I believe it's only 250 hours that you need to work to remain a registered nurse. So the number of registered nurses that Australia has it's inflated dramatically because you only have to work one shift a month over 2 years
to maintain registration.
Oh, wow. And, from a personal point of view, I understand the reason for it, but how do you feel knowing that you could have between, $40,000 and $100,000 worth of HECS and a registered nurse has none? What does that mean from your point of view, as a personal point of view?
I mean, it's difficult. I obviously would love to be walking out of university scot-free with no debt, but I do also understand that the need is different. So nurses are, I mean, this goes to all of these sort of teaching, nursing, all of these jobs that have these dramatic shortages that need to be addressed like now. Like this is not something we can continue to delay. We need nurses, we need teachers, and we need them to be of a high quality. So I understand it, but it is frustrating. It is difficult to look at sometimes and think, oh, that would be nice. And I can certainly understand people who are opting to choose these degrees, opting to enroll in nursing, if it means that you can obtain a degree and potentially have no HECS. So,
but it's
some of that simplistic trap of government saying we need 20,000 additional nursing numbers, but if you engage the existing workforce instead of them doing one shift a month and give them better working conditions, then maybe you've already addressed the problem with the capacity that you have, or it's a mix of a bit of these things rather than absolute trying to pick winners. It seems to me like government policy is a bit like putting money on betting on horses at a race. No betting for a place. You're just putting it on the nose for a win, which strikes me as highly problematic.
And it's interesting. It's more complex than that. Like I had never really considered that or even thought about it. But if you're just doing the degree because it's free and is an easy way to get there, the data is saying you're not doing it because you're passionate or it's your purpose. You're just doing it because it's a job, which means when the job gets really difficult, which I'd imagine it would happen pretty quickly as a nurse, right? You start having night shifts and, difficult people and all of that sort of stuff. Your motivation to then continue to do that drops off. And then, as you said, there's a lot of leakage coming out of our public system into NDIS and aged care and those sorts of things where you can work less and probably get paid fairly similar sort of numbers, which means the issue is really, really complex and certainly not something, as you said, the government's brushstrokes makes an answer for.
No, well, we came to the conclusion that the core of the issue is retention or attraction, and you need to make a choice. The government has consistently chosen attraction as their solution, so bring more people in. But what we found is that's not the right idea. It's about how do we make the systems more efficient? How do we make nurses more productive? How do we incentivize? We've got nurses here. How do we incentivize them to work full time?
Good.
So, and sometimes that's not about increasing their wages because that's a whole nother issue. But maybe how do we reduce costs in another area? And that might be housing, that might be education for their children, that might be a number of things, but if we can reduce stress and financial burdens in other areas of existing nurses' lives, it's not only about having more nurses participating, but the level of healthcare provided to our communities is also going to skyrocket.
Yeah, that's so well thought about. That makes so much sense to me as well. Like, rather than just the blunt tool of we just need more in that end, and that'll end up with more people out the other end. If they're actually engaged, they're within community, and they also have a reason to be there, which is to say, okay, well, there might be a financial benefit as far as it's easy to find housing, or it's easy to reduce your cost of living, or know that your kids are cared for in those areas. That makes so much sense, because I imagine if you took someone who's part-time into full-time, that's a dramatic impact on the workforce. If you got all of those people who are part-time into full-time, well then that would be a massive take-up, and that probably goes to the complexity of the issue. So and that's sort of maybe where it crosses over into the conversation in regards to housing, because that must be an impact of what people's or their decisions on where they can and can't go. So I know you started to do some digging around, Rowan, but what did you find in regards to maybe where the hospitals are and what that looks like when you consider property in relationship to hospitals?
Yeah, it struck me that, pulling out data then opens a whole bunch of are we comparing apples and apples kind of question. And this, I think, is the start of our challenge with any of these comments. If we use headlines like 70%, well, 70% of what? Is it your gross pay or your after-tax pay? It's an enormous difference in what that means for you in a household and your lived experience. But looking just at Woolloongabba, inner city Brisbane, and this is the start of the conversation with the headlines in Hunter's article that got us thinking about this space. If you were somehow transplanted from Mars and decided that you wanted to work at the hospital near Woolloongabba, and you wanted to buy into that space, then the average property price in that area to purchase and to enter is about $1.2 million. And if you said on average household income, the average nurse income, and maybe an $80,000 salary as a couple, so we've got a combined household income after tax, and we break that down to weekly numbers.
Yep.
If you were to go and pay a mortgage on a weekly basis over a 30-year period, that would be 74% of your after-tax combined household income. In an example of a nurse averages $84,000 a year.
64, I think it was 64 or 65.
Sorry, 64. I said. Yep. Sorry, 64 is the correct number. And let's say you had a partner who's earning a bit better than that at $80,000 gross.
Yep.
Now that if we think back to the benchmark that used to be the standard was 30% of your income can go to your home mortgage for a balanced and sustainable household. And that number has been obliterated of recent, but that was the starting of that conversation, was back in the 70s and 80s. If you were going for a loan and the bank would say, what's your household income? And they'd lend you up to 30% of that household income. So 74% is dramatically outside of that. If we wanted to go to Woolloongabba and we had a healthier household income, so let's say there's a two people household income, and we have a gross annual income of 200,000. That's still 50%, 56% of your take-home payment each week, each month, each year going to your mortgage payment. for a 30-year mortgage with 10% down.
And obviously, as we're talking about essential workers, I mean, that's part of this problem, isn't it? Like their ability to earn that amount of money is currently not possible. So looking at the essential workers position, you know, I think the article said 72%, and I think the calculation we got to was fairly similar to that.
Yeah.
Says that, you know, if you had to buy a house in the Wollongabba area and, you know, the house price median is $1.2 million, you bought one of those and you had $100,000 and you didn't have $100,000 in HECS debt. So you showed up at the table and someone gave you a loan and you had those numbers. I think the repayments are still something like $6,500 a month in repayments, which means that's just an astronomical high percentage of your total salary. Yeah. And then you have the real issues, as Hunter just talked about, is that from a nurse's point of view, that doesn't make any sense as far as how do you have childcare. I think you had a graph there, Hunter, as well, which was talking about the cost of living for a nurse.
Yeah, there's a play graph there. Colby.
I think it's up a little bit. Is it that one there?
Yep.
Just go up a little bit. That one there. So just zoom in a little bit there if you can, CJ, to see whether we can see it a bit larger. So just talk to that. What does that tell us?
So this is just a standard cost of living in Australia. And just notably that I saw was if we take that $64,000 that we've identified as the average nursing pay, and then you put travel to and from work, rent, utilities, and food, which I believe is just essential spending, that's 80% of their salary gone. And then that comes down, that's $51,000 taken up a year. And then looking at existing government incentives to help with childcare, is they can subsidize, the maximum is 85%. So assuming only one child, will be generous, or only one child, that's still over $4,000 a year, which leaves nurses with less than $10,000 a year. And obviously there's a bunch of things that we haven't discussed that nurses need to expend here. So you got your insurances, you've got unexpected expenditures, you've got, if you want to live some sort of life, if you want to travel, if you want to pay for your kids to play a sport, if you want to pay for yourself to play a sport, all of these things fitting into $10,000. And I've said there as well, more concerning is that childcare fees are rising faster than inflation and wage growth. So if you're a single nurse in particular, there's a choice to be made. Do you want a house or do you want a kid? It's to some extent. It just, you can't afford to send your child to childcare and work full time and pay your mortgage and be remotely close to, and it comes back to remotely close to not only hospitals but schools. You need to have a childcare center in close proximity to your place of work. Otherwise, that little blue piece of the pie, transportation, is going to start to occupy a greater and greater percentage of the pie, and it's going to get to the point where you need to start putting sacrifices somewhere else. And with, like I said, less than $10,000 there, where does the sacrifice come?
And we've actually got a good question, which we'll do. So in the chat there, we've got a bit of a question in regards to the difference in between public hospital and private or for-profit hospitals. But before we get there, I thought something that is very interesting in this is of the assumption that rent is 32% of your household costs. Now, everything we've looked at in proximity to, even the rental costs in proximity to any of these hospitals that we've talked about, far exceed that. So it says any nurse without massive support, either as a couple or whatever, just has no chance at all of getting anywhere. And then, as you said, you have this really dual-edged sword. So say you decide you want to be a nurse in Wollongabba, but you can't afford to live there and you have to go further away, then the cost of transport would skyrocket. and I would imagine you'd also have this impact on your living. Like the reason I don't visit Rowan very much is because even when I get there, it takes an hour and a half to go anywhere. Like if you were in an outer suburb going, yeah, thank goodness I'm only paying $450 a week. If you had to travel an hour and a half each way, what life do you end up with? Is a very good question. So that's a very good point. But there's a question there, and I think, and I'm just paraphrasing what you've been talking to, Hunter, but you can probably answer the question specifically. We've got a question there. Do we have a chart which compares the salary of nurses in a public hospital versus a nurse in a private or for-profit hospital?
I don't believe we have a chart in our document that we're looking at now. I have a chart in some of the reports that we've done at uni, but the baseline difference between them is the public sector has better benefits, and so the government loves to incentivize certain routes in the public sector and offer supporting for their housing as well, one-off payments. But in private sector, the room for growth is tremendous. And the big thing we've been talking about when we come back to childcare is, as a registered nurse in the public sector, to some extent, you're forced to work night shift. So if you're paying for your child to go to daycare during the day, and they're at daycare all day, and then all night you're at work, you're never seeing your child. So one of the biggest drains is not necessarily salary between public, private, and non-for-profit, but how do you manage your work and your home life? So the ability to spend time with your children, but also the ability to choose your own path to some extent. From what we found, the private and public sector starting salaries for nurses is fairly similar. But especially when we start to talk about contracted private work, NDIS work, things along those lines, that's when pay becomes a bit greater than that of a public sector registered nurse. But then that compounds with the ability to better manage your work and home life, and the ability to better manage your finances and time with your children and things along these lines. So
that makes so much sense. And also and as you said, I think when we originally started, a lot of the upfront demand is in the public sector, and that's why the government's getting involved and incentivizing things like HEX reduction or HEX whatever, is to get people into the public system. But then you have this dual dichotomy, as you said. If people go, I get into that system and go, this is burning me out, I can't find a work-life balance, I'm sure they'd slide across into the private or for-profit sector, and some of that might not be about wages, from what you're saying. That might just be about just a better way to actually have a life, rather than having children and you're working at night and they're at school during the day, and you pass sometime in the middle and have essentially someone else raising your children, when really you've entered a profession which is about caring. So this is that. I really like this conversation about the complexity of all the nuances of how challenging this problem is, before you layer what that means to housing and how it's possible. Because that graph that you had up there says, it just answers everything. It's physically impossible for an essential worker to be living close to their place of employment and find a way to actually survive with normal household costs. The numbers just don't add up. So subsequently, what we're having is putting more people on the road because they have to transport, their transportation costs. Because you just said, did you say, Rowan, that even in some of those outer suburbs, the cost, it's got rent per month there, but the cost of accommodation is still, even in places like, heading out as far as Ipswich, it's still up around the, 25 to 30%. And in all those other areas, it's, I think that might be higher actually, CJ, up the top.
Yeah, so the Ipswich, the numbers in a city centre of Ipswich get better, but the mortgage payments for the nursing couple are still ballistically. So if we've got one salary at 64, which is the average nursing salary, and one at 80 in a household, Ipswich is still 33% of your take-home income, which by 1970s and 1980s measure would have been the upper limit of absolutely what's possible. So it's certainly not an easy option.
I find it interesting
when you start travelling distances to places like Ipswich, you can be 40 minutes each way on public transport, the most efficient way to get there.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You also said when you have a look at some of this data, a lot of the information is skewed to people already in the market. So, like all that median house data and median house price and all those other things, that's assuming you've already purchased something, right? So we're looking at it as saying, okay, well, what's the lure to try and get an essential worker to a nurse to want to move to Woolloongabba right this second and make it happen? It's physically impossible. Like, I don't understand. The government's looking at the numbers going, oh, we're trying to make this happen. There's no way it can happen. Like, I don't understand any of that has a path that if you're not already embedded there, that you could actually find a way into that market. What are they saying about house prices in Brisbane? I mean, obviously we've got a thing called the Olympics if we actually have it. But what are they saying about house prices generally are supposed to happen?
So when I got here, which was 2018, I was reading by educated people commenting on the housing space that we could expect a doubling or tripling of house pricing between then and the Olympics. And my first response was, what a crock. There's no way housing can do that. However, I'm here to say that we are absolutely on that trajectory. So between 2018 and today, lots of parts of Brisbane have had enormous uptick. Certainly suburb by suburb at the moment, you could look back at the last 12 months and see some places that have stepped back a few percentage points over the last 12 months. But if you take the long view, and nobody wants to look at anything in the long view because that's far too uncomfortable, but the actual, this is a stretch of my memory, when I finished school, the average price of a house in Brisbane was about $30,000. This year, it'll be about $1 million. And I didn't finish school that long ago. It was a while back. But the rate of appreciation is still far in excess of CPI, far in excess of what's sustainable for a essential services worker wanting to relocate to work at a hospital or a school or a particular address. It's not getting better anytime soon.
No, that's right. And Flintstones might have been around when you were going to school, but you're right. I mean, that's not a very long period of time, and you'd have to. So they're talking about this, as you said, Woolloongabba by the time by the time the Olympics come around and the number of people they're proposing enter there, it's certainly not getting any less. Like, it's getting more and more expensive. And then what will happen after the Olympics? Like, everyone has that question. Like, property, everyone says, will property continue to rise forever? Well, there's got to be some reasons which would say that's not possible, that you can have a constant rise in something over time. From a economics point of view, does that make any sense that houses will continue to rise in value forever, Hunter?
I mean, in theory, prices will continue to rise forever, but it's not meaning it's sustainable over the window we're talking about. So talking about a build up to the Olympics is all fine and well, but then what happens to the structures in place after the Olympics? What happens when this massive percentage of permanent residents are removed when they're only here to watch the Olympics? What happens when you've bought this house for $3 million to use as an Airbnb and no one wants to stay in it anymore? And you are using that Airbnb money to pay your mortgage. There's all of these issues about, and it's also causing problems for the government to try and push wage growth to match inflation is ridiculous. We can't manage to keep this going. And what happens for Brisbane in particular post Olympics is going to be interesting to see how do you manage that, and how do we fix if there's people staying in Brisbane CBD or close to the city there where the hospitals are, who are occupying that space purely because they're having money from different countries and they leave, and there's all these vacant homes. What happens to home prices? Will they fall if you say they keep rising? Who's buying them?
Yeah, and there has been instances like, and this is obviously talking about, one of the challenges with property is it underpins so much wealth that you have had these adjustments in different countries. Like even I understand New Zealand had a correction in their property prices. So what happens if the prices do again double and Woolloongabba goes to $2.4 million or whatever before the Olympics, and then we have a 20% adjustment? This probably goes to the last factor, which I think is worth chatting about for the last 10 or 15 minutes, which is this consistent with what our society feels is the best way to live? So we're on this massive hamster wheel, and obviously have the situation where someone like yourself has to consider, in the next couple of years, going to go out and get employment, having a look at where you would have jobs. I think you mentioned something about employment sites starting to see some key searches which are indicating something about property as well. So what is that? What are some of the questions that people are searching for on employment sites?
So something that we interestingly came across by accident when we were looking for nursing data was that one of the most common searches on Seek and Finder and those employment websites is working from home. So those people who are looking for jobs are more and more prioritizing working from home. So flexibility could be one answer, but I think the more logical answer is cost of living. So the whole reason for years that people have been migrating from these regional towns, from places like Townsville, India capital cities, is for personal growth, because
yes,
you can have better room for wage growth, better room for starting salaries. But there begins to come a time where it says, if your wage is $80,000, but your cost of living is 20% greater living in a capital city, is it really worth packing up and moving? And I think that's the conversation people are starting to have. And I think I've had conversations with nursing and pharmacy graduates who are looking for jobs in the next 12 to 24 months. And the biggest areas that need them is rurally, so out west, and the relocation payments that they're offering, and the long-term packages, and covering housing, covering expenses with fuel, things like that. More and more people are trying to find ways to grow personally that doesn't involve them moving to a capital city because they can't afford to live there.
Yeah,
that makes so much sense. So is the cost of living, you're saying it's 20% higher in a capital city? Is that what the numbers tell you?
I'm just referencing as in,
yes.
So talking about net benefits. So if you could earn $20,000 more in a capital city, but you have to pay $20,000 more a year on your mortgage repayments, or for rent, or for travel, all of these things cumulatively, it doesn't become worth. Well, to some extent, that's down to value judgments in the end of the day. But from my perspective, if my net pay is not increasing, there really isn't an incentive to move. And I think that's why there has been such a big push for people to look for working from home, is can they find ways to grow in their personal life and grow through their wages without having to incur these huge costs of mortgages that are remotely close to the city. And if you can avoid driving an hour a day to work and you can just wake up and walk into an office, I think people are opting towards that a lot more recently.
Makes a lot of sense. Just as a matter of interest, Ryan, did you have it'd be interesting to find out, like, what is the median house price in Townsville now versus the median house price in Brisbane? I know they're only sort of, again, major generalizations, but it'd be interesting to see, because that is obviously from the pie chart you said, like, the housing is a massive part of the cost of living, right? So it would underpin a lot of your increased cost of living in a capital city would be a relationship between the cost of housing, right? So if a median house price is 380,000 in Townsville and it's 900, that's a 50% increase, which means you'd have to have a 50% increase in that percentage of your wage just to justify the housing cost differences.
And I think you need to consider that pie chart is the Australian average. So those little pieces of that pie are going to shift around depending on where you are. And I think if you looked more specifically in the capital cities, I think that the rent component or the mortgage component is going to start to creep up towards 40% because do look at house prices, and especially if you're taking into consideration existing owners of homes as well. I think especially people of my age, and this extends to nursing graduates, teaching graduates, all of these essential workers over the next 5 to 10 years, the amount of money that they will have to pay as fresh entry jobs is going to be substantial.
Yeah, absolutely. What do those numbers tell us, Rowan, roughly? It'd be interesting to see what Townsville's up to now, because it was as low as 320,000, but you can tell that's substantially jumped over the last year. But I would imagine the median house price in Brisbane has got to be approaching $1 million, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been a while since I looked. I'm just pulling it up now.
Yeah, and that'll give us a really good indicator as a general number. And from what you're saying, also from the people you speak to, prioritizing a better lifestyle is now becoming more important than necessarily having job advancement in a capital city. Is that something you've seen as a common theme with people who are going through university at the moment? They are having that real balance between how do I find career advancement, but being mindful of the fact that I don't want to do that if it's going to cost me more money it's going to cost me in well-being to get there.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think everyone would love to say they're earning as much money as possible, but you look at the data, and I'm talking about nursing in particular, but such a high percentage of them are only working part-time work because they simply can't handle the burden of their financial stress on top of their workplace stress. So I think there's definitely some sort of shift, perhaps, that there's conversations between these graduates of, that it'd be great to go and work in Brisbane, but can I afford it? If I'm a fresh graduate working full time, do I want to come home to a house with 6 other people just because that's what I have to do to make it affordable? Mm-hmm. Like, am I a full-time worker who I've got this salary that I've waited my whole life to earn, but I'm sleeping on a couch, splitting rent 6 ways because that's the only way I can afford to stay anywhere near my place of work? Is that the life that I envisioned after incurring $40,000 in HECS?
Yeah, it's another factor to it, isn't it?
Was it worth going to uni if it means, which is the other thing, you have that conversation with people who have entered the market already through trades or through retail or certificates who are working full-time there who haven't incurred that debt. People have to have that value judgment out of high school is, do I want to go to university knowing full well that I will be having a HECS debt at the end of it, even though there is an earnment has shown that you will eventually exceed that, but finding jobs in capital cities, you've got that cost of living, you've got that, I suppose, mental and emotional burden as well with managing all of the costs that you need to consider.
Absolutely. And some data there says Townsville's median house price has risen to 430,000, which is quite a substantial rise. And some of the rough numbers out of Brisbane, and I imagine this is a fairly wide sweep, obviously, because you'd have some pretty low
There's
costs.
pockets up and down. That's right.
But you're looking at 810,000. So almost double. So it says that some of the stuff you're talking about is 100% spot on. Like, even though you've just generalized that number, if you've got the return on investment is going to be the same, right? If you've got $1 million property and you want to get 6% return on it or 4% return on it, then you need to charge X in rent. And that's the same in housing. So in between the two of them, if you've got, if it's 100% more expensive to rent, and there's probably disparities in there, but it just goes to show that there really is that dichotomy at the moment. Like, would you give up a lifestyle to go for a career advancement when it turns out you're actually worse off in a net impact side of things?
And that's actually becoming, people are asking those questions. All of us have had experience of living in the regions and understand the lifestyle of a 5-minute or a 20-minute commute with no red lights or very few, familiar roads, low stress. And then you go, hang on, I'm going to the capital city. I'm going to double my cost of living. I'm going to have all this downtime in commuting and arguing with traffic and roadworks, et cetera, for what benefit? And if we have any serious conversation, which is the intention perhaps of these Monday catch-ups, and look behind the headlines. And so for a regional tradie or a profession to go, I'm moving from Townsville to the Big Smoke and my salary's gone up $20,000 because of that, it sounds attractive. But the reality is, when you break it down, as Hunter's pointing out, you add on the real cost of housing, the real cost of everything else that goes with that, and you often might find yourself behind the 8 ball. And it comes down to values. Do I prefer the lifestyle of the regions or the lifestyle of the metro?
Yeah, or even, do I want to have enough money up my sleeve to go on holiday or buy a new car or whatever? And all of those things play in there. And I think also the other thing, which even Linda talked about when I spoke to her, there was this, you actually get trapped in that as well, right? And I think maybe Hunter doing, a degree that crosses over in economics. I've heard a few of his mates talk, and I'm not quite sure they're having this cost-benefit analysis that maybe is naturally in Hunter's thinking from doing it, because I hear someone go, I'm just going to buy a property, and you go, why? And then there's literally no response to that. So because they haven't really thought through what would be the actual impact to me if I did that. And when you have a look at those information, if it's 50%, even in Townsville, if it's 50% of your wage, because obviously your wage is lesser in the regions, so you go and buy that $450,000 thing, you're still the percentages are the same of your income, and you are literally shackled to that thing there. So this is actually a question, Hunter. Are you finding, of the friend group that you're in, would people be comfortable locking themselves into 50 to 70% of their total income in a mortgage? Do you think, in your friend group, how would they feel?
I don't know that people are thinking it through that far. I think the idea of owning a home is so glamorous at this age, and independence is something that we all want. We want to be our own people and we want to have our own space. And I've had this conversation with a multitude of friends about, that's all good and well, but you need to think about 5 years. You need to think about 10 years. You need to think about, how do I, and the other thing is if you do enter into a contract or a mortgage in regional Queensland, you will be in regional Queensland for the next 5 to 10 years, because I don't see a way that, given their occupation or given their lifestyle, that you can have a mortgage in one place and at the same time get a net benefit enough. Like, I don't think you can charge enough in rent to justify then moving to a different region and obtaining a second mortgage or renting off somebody else or anything of that. And it's a difficult decision to make, especially when you think about the trajectory that our cost of living is on as it is. 5 to 10 years, you don't know where we could be at. This conversation could be a bit more dire than it is now, which would be scary. But when you think about, well, possible, especially when you think about,
there's no indicators to say it's going to change.
No. And you've got aging population to factor into this whole equation once again about people my age. What kind of tax implication is it going to be passed down onto us to pay for the increase in the aging population? So the government's made tax breaks recently, but they're going to have to pick them up eventually.
Very good point. And I don't think anyone's even looking at that. I mean, some of those stats, those big headline stats that we saw originally when we started working in the space, Rowan, about, this idea that when the pension was originally designed, there was 7 taxpayers to every pensioner.
Yep.
Now there's going to be, by the time we're 65, there's going to be less than 2 or around 2 to every pensioner. And we know the system is actually biased to make you use the pension, because ultimately the cost of aged care is all means tested. So a lot of people are trying to find a way to get back into the pension space, because ultimately there's a financial benefit to do that. And maybe it's a bit like Hunter's statement about, probably being politically correct there as well, saying, yes, we need nurses. So yes, we need to find a way to incentivize that space. There's also an incentivization for those baby boomers who have paid a lot of tax to go, okay, well, now I want to go into my retirement and capture some of that tax. So I'm going to go into the pension. But the next generation becomes then bundled with that, bundled with the real cost of that being in there as well. So, yeah, and I think this has been a fantastic chat, because we've only touched on some minor layers of this complexity. Like, we haven't really, and you've raised some points that, Hunter, that, need to be taken into account. And what is the next generation going to do? Are they going to want to do this silly game? When you look at it, it is a silly game. Is there enough people who have, maybe as Hunter alluded to, who aren't thinking it through enough to continue to throw themselves onto the fire? Or does it get to a point where everyone stands back and says, hey, my life is more important, my lifestyle is more important, enjoying myself, and you've already mentioned that a sense of purpose is now impacting on where people want to work and what they want to work from. And I'm not sure that was the case, certainly in our generation, Rowan. It was a job, but the data is actually pointing to the fact that purpose is a really important part of your employment and the rest of the picture there that fits it.
One of the, just in closing, just as a really interesting observation out of the COVID stuff, we've had this lockdown of city centres, and I understand that we still haven't reactivated these city centres. Brisbane itself is trying to find a reason to go to the city centre for the Olympics. So it has a pressing deadline, but it can't articulate a catchphrase. It's not the Harbour City, it's not the Brown Snake City. What the heck is Brisbane about? Melbourne has some culture.
It's a Brown Snake City. It's got some really big marketing problems.
That's what I'm really marketing.
The Brown Snake City.
A brown snake. What else would you call it? But even commercial spaces, are trying to draw their workers back in to occupy these tower blocks that are office space. And as a society, we're saying, I need to go in there for why? I've got an internet connection, I've got a laptop, I can do this at home. Why is my employer insisting on that?
Absolutely, and everything Hunter talked about there just reiterates that. The search data says that. So that's very, very intriguing in regards to what it could look like in the future. And that's been a really enlightening conversation. So 100%.
Thanks very much for you jumping on board, Hunter, and tipping a few more ideas into this discussion.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. We will hopefully get a guest lined up for next week. We've had a couple of weeks off with illness, and circumstances have conspired against us. But we do have a list of people who are putting their hand up. It's just a matter of aligning the stars and planets for them to come on board. We do prefer to do the live conversation, which, as you can tell, with our polished production skills and quality hosts, it goes really well.
Okay.
Whatever.
But it is good, because we had some really good conversation there that got some depth around the issues, which is important, because it's only between talking with the expert or someone who's got a really good understanding or good grasp of the area that you get these nuances in there and you go, hang on, well, there's some stuff today that has been really add some real depth to this conversation, which basically says poor old essential workers, as I see it, just have no way, particularly if they're new to a space, to be able to work anywhere near the place of their employment, which goes to the intent of the start of our conversation today. As I see it, there is no space or no place at the moment that our essential workers can work. Can live where they work.
How do we then offer them a lifestyle that they can sign on to stay as our community workers? If they've got to commute extensive distances or do crazy things to have 3 boarders in the house, etc., to afford it, all of that stuff blows up sooner or later.
Yeah, it's been great.
Alrighty.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, gents. Have a cracking day all round, and let's hope that Christine can come back to us next week as well with maybe a guest.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a cracking day.